Welcome to our local history talk this month, Reconsidering Slavery in 17th Century New Netherland. What do we know? What can we learn? By Dennis J. Maika. The lecture is one of the collaborations in 2022 between the library and the Jacob Leisler Institute. Each features an expert in early colonial history, and we're very excited about this topic. It's very current and a good thing for all of us to be looking at. The Hudson Area Library has a history room dedicated to preserving and making accessible to the public the history of Hudson, Greenport, and Stockport, which are our library service areas. The history room is open by appointment and also on Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. And we also have online research requests for information on local history that you can fill out at our website. And Emily will be putting that link in, and that's a free service that we offer to the public. Also on this website is information on our collection, including images, PDFs of the Hudson City directories from 1851 on. I think we have about 16 online right now. Video links to our programs and historic footage of Hudson. And we also have finding aids for our physical archived collections that are here, as well as links to online resources on local history and our online history room shop that I hope that you will check. Anyone that wishes to donate to the library's history room can visit HudsonAreaLibrary.org or go to our history room page where there's a donate button. So each year we do several programs with the Leisler Institute. We're very grateful for this partnership and to be working with Dr. David Voorhees, the director of the Institute that's headquartered in Hudson. And Emily will put his website, the Jacob Leisler Institute, in the chat box. He's also the managing editor of the Moon, the Half Moon, a quarterly scholarly journal published by the Holland Society of New York. An NYU research scientist, he is a former managing reference history editor at Charles Scribner's and Sons, and has published numerous historical works and articles. And he's been a consultant on historical exhibits at the Museum of the City of New York and the Bard Graduate Center in Manhattan, among others. The Jacob Leisler Institute for the Study of Early New York History is an independent, not-for-profit study and research center devoted to collecting, preserving, and disseminating information relating to colonial New York under English rule. In the years spanning 1663 to 1773, New York's provinces, diverse European settlements, and Native Americans and African populations fused into a cosmopolitan colonial territory with ties throughout the Atlantic world. The Institute is unique in focusing on this underexamined 109-year period in American history. So now I will give you to David Voorhees, who will be introducing our speaker. David?
Thank you, Brenda.
Thank you.
It is with much appreciation to again be thanking the Hudson Area Library for hosting the Jacob Leisler Institute's lecture series. This series is made possible through the generous support of the Dyke Family Foundation and the Hudson River Bank and Trust Foundation. It is with great pleasure that I introduce tonight's speaker, Dennis Maika. Dr. Maika, a historian of colonial New York with a PhD from New York University, is senior historian at the Netherland Institute. He has written numerous articles, served as a consultant for a variety of local history and education projects, and taught history and psychology at the high school and college level for several decades. His article, "To Experiment with a Parcel of Negroes, Incentive, Collaboration, and Competition in New Amsterdam Slave Trade," was a winner of New Netherland Institute's 2021 Clegg and Carol Van Slyke Article Prize. He is currently working on a book about Manhattan merchants in the Dutch and English periods of 17th century New York. Dr. Maika presents this evening a fresh look at slavery in 17th century New Netherland and New York. By examining new revelations and the questions they raise, He intends to provide a better understanding of the role of slavery in New Netherland and stimulate a more accurate and comprehensive portrayal of American slavery and its legacy. Dr. Maika.
Okay, well, thank you, David, and thank you to Brenda and to Emily for inviting me and to having me, and thank you to Brenda and Emily for taking care of all the technological aspects of this. It's reassuring, so I really appreciate that. When David first asked me to speak a while ago, I thought I'd talk about my current book project on Manhattan merchants, but there's been so much new work done recently about the subject of slavery in New Netherland, and I've been involved in some of that work myself, that I thought I'd use this invitation as an opportunity to reconsider some of those new things that have been done in that broader context, and then to share what historians now know, much of it, with you. And I think it's important that you learn more about this as well. Slavery is an important topic, as is legacy, and it's become more critical in the popular discourse as of late. And as I've been following that general discussion, it's been painfully obvious that what is lacking in this conversation is some awareness of what happened in New Netherland and in New York, what the experience was in 17th and 18th century, in 19th century. It's a legacy, it's a sad legacy, but it's a legacy that all Americans share, all American colonies share. It's not just a Southern concern. But why is this important, and how do we take this new information and how do we use it? It's a difficult question, but I've been inspired by some recent work that's been done by the people at the Amsterdam Museum that I've had the opportunity to talk to recently. And they've done a very credible job with a very difficult subject, and it relates to something called the Golden Coach. The Golden Coach is what you see on the left. It was built in 1898 in honor of the installation of the 18-year-old Queen Wilhelmina. It's been used ever since for royal weddings and ceremonies, but it's especially been used into the 21st century for the opening of Parliament every September. It was a gift from the city of Amsterdam to the royal family, but it's always been controversial. And it's become especially more concerning in the Netherlands because of the restoration that's been given to it and the tribute from the colonies side panel that you see there on the right. I have an arrow showing you where it is on the coach and then what you see. And if you take a look at it, it doesn't portray the people of the empire in an even light. It shows, clearly that people did not share in all the benefits of the Golden Age, and that people, especially people of color, were exploited. But the strategy of the Amsterdam Museum is what I think has been fascinating. Their strategy is to try to engage all the various constituencies in an ongoing dialogue that's stimulated by sharing all the research that they've sponsored. So to paraphrase Margriet Schabermacher, who's the artistic director there, she thinks that educating the general public, and I'm quoting from her, with the most accurate information available and engaging them in discussion is, quote, the best way to reduce the distance between those who feel involved, and also to create opportunities for mutual understanding. And to me, I think that's a critical message for us. So my goal today is to try to encourage discussion and dialogue by offering the best available evidence of 17th century slavery in New Netherland, the experience of the enslaved, the slave trade, the legalities of slavery. It's a topic that's relatively unknown among the general public and generally misunderstood. But I'd like to share some of those new discoveries, and hopefully we can overcome some of the typical stereotypes. So first, I'd like to focus on the slave trade, which to me is critically important to understanding how slavery evolved in the colony, and also share the results of my most recent research and something that's about to be published as well. And then next, I'd like to focus on what we know about the life for those that were enslaved, and to share some of the recent revelations of some historians. Not everything that has been done recently, we just don't have time for that, but happily, you're going to be able to see Andrea Mosterman in May, and you'll get a chance to hear from her firsthand of what her incredible research has yielded. At the end, though, after I offer some general conclusions and summaries, I'd like to invite you, the audience, to reflect on what this might mean for the current discussion about slavery and its legacy. Rather than me tell you what to think, I'd like to follow the model that was set up by the Amsterdam Museum and have you begin the discussion via the chat component in the Zoom meeting today, which I know we won't be able to settle, but I hope it's a chance for you to do it. I'm not going to tell you what to think about this, but I think it's important that you begin to draw some conclusions about this. And I'd love to know what you think, because I've been struggling with this question for a while. Okay, but first, let me give you a little background of what New Netherland is. This is a standard map that many of you may have seen about what New Netherland was, how New Netherland was interpreted in 1650. You can see the Hudson River. I guess you would be right about here. New York City is here. What is now New Jersey? Oops, what is now New Jersey there? Staten Island is in here. Then down into what's called the South River, and into the Chesapeake, which is a little bit further here. And then notice that they actually include parts of what's now Cape Cod, and all of this is under the title of New Nederland, not Netherlands, New Netherlands, singular. Here's another easier to read map to show you what the area of New Netherland is. The area that's down here, the South River, the Delaware River, the North River was the Hudson River, and Connecticut River. So when we talk about New Netherland, we're referring to this entire area, that covers several different states in today's America. And New Amsterdam was the center of this colony, the capital, with what they call the staple port through which all trade would operate. But let me begin now talking a little bit about the slave trade. It's important to understand, the reason why I want to start with the slave trade is because we have to realize, and I think many of us do, that those enslaved Africans who populated New Netherland were not willing travelers. These were, to say the least, they were forced migrants. So it's difficult to imagine for me, anyone buying and selling human beings. Like, why could this happen? How could people possibly understand that and rationalize that? And my answer is that because commodification of individuals, putting a price tag on individuals, was something that was the essential element from the 16th century into the 19th century. And this is a general picture of the slave trade covering those different centuries. I like it because it's from the transatlantic slave trade database. I like it because it shows how widespread slavery was in the Atlantic world at the time. In the 16th century, the first slave trade voyage that was known to have taken place from Africa to the Americas went to the Spanish colony, to the island of Hispaniola. There it is. Then in the 1560s, regular voyages were made to Veracruz, Cartagena, and to the Isthmus of Panama, and then into Peru, which you really can't see much here. By the time of the 17th century, the Dutch have entered into the slave trade. The areas that the Dutch are primarily involved in the time period that we're talking about in the early 17th century, we're going to be in this area here, into the colony of Brazil, and I can only see your pictures, but obviously in this part of Africa, and then this parts of the Caribbean. And there is New Amsterdam, Beverwijk, and New Amsterdam. The reason why the Dutch were interested in this is primarily to combat Spain. They had been fighting for their independence from Spain since the 1570s. They finally achieved their independence in the 1640s, 1648. And they saw that the way to challenge Spain was to challenge Spain's overseas empire. And when Spain and Portugal were unified under their combined crowns, Portugal became, a similar kind of enemy. So this is the motivation that brings the Dutch initially into this part of the world. The West India Company, which is organized in 1621 and actually finally capitalized in 1623, was primarily a war machine meant to try to target the Spanish and the Portuguese possessions in the Atlantic. And that's how the slave trade first came to New Netherland. It came as a result of Dutch privateers. Privateers were essentially private vessels that were given letters of marque and sponsored by the government of the Netherlands to attack Spanish ships to confiscate the cargo, sink the ships if possible, and use it as part of the war effort. And here you see a picture of one of the most famous privateers, also admiral in the Dutch fleet, Piet Hein, who captures the Spanish fleet, the Silver Fleet in 1628. But it's as a result of these privateering expeditions that enslaved Africans are first brought to New Netherland. Most historians would recognize that the first enslaved Africans came probably around in the mid 1620s. My friend and colleague Jacob thinks he has found the first privateer that brought enslaved Africans to New Netherland, and that's the Brownvis in August of 1627. But after that, a limited number of privateers, probably two in 1636, maybe one we know for sure of in 1646, one that originated in New Amsterdam that same year, and then I know of another one in 1652. So maybe four overall, in addition to the Brownvis, brought enslaved Africans to New Netherland. The reason I mention that number, and want you to realize that it's a small number, is that there is never really a direct slave trade between Africa and New Netherland that's sponsored by the Dutch West India Company until 1655. And I'll show you that in just a second. The Dutch West India Company constantly talked about sending slaves to New Netherland, but they were more interested in Brazil. They talked about sending it. They wanted to do that. They offered different possibilities, but it never really happened. And it didn't really happen until 1655. And this is something that I've just written about that I'd like to share with you now. The first of these voyages was the voyage of a ship called de Wittepart, which is Dutch for the White Horse. And this takes place it's capitalized in 1654. It leaves Amsterdam. It goes to the Guinea coast. It may have gone to the Caribbean. One of the documents says that it was supposed to go, but we have no evidence that it stopped any place. I believe it might have stopped at Guadeloupe, but we're not really sure. Then it goes to New Amsterdam, and then finally back to Amsterdam. What's interesting about this voyage is that it's organized by two private investors who get permission from the West India Company to undergo this particular adventure, is what they called it. The two men were called Dirk Peterson Wittepart, who named the ship after himself or added that name to his own name. That was common practice. We don't really know for sure. Dirk Wittepart was significant because he was involved in the Dutch trade directly with the Virginia and Maryland in the Chesapeake. So he had experience with the tobacco trade. He understood, he had contacts in Virginia. He had recently sold his first boat called the Wittepart to a Virginia tobacco planter who ended up moving to Maryland. His name was Simon Overzet, who promptly took the boat and sailed it to New England and wrecked it someplace in New England. But so Wittepart, Simon Peterson Wittepart, has a new ship and decides that he wants to undertake a voyage to the Guinea coast to bring slaves to New Netherland. And the primary reason for that was because he saw that there was an opportunity to transship slaves from New Amsterdam to the Chesapeake, because that's where the market was. The market was not in New Amsterdam. The market was in the Chesapeake. His partner in this was a man named Jan de Swerts. And Jan de Swerts was from a family that were active in the Brazilian adventure by the Dutch West India Company. Their father, Francois, was a West India Company official. Jan and his two brothers were active merchants in Brazil. But when Brazil was lost to the Dutch in 1654, notice the date, when Brazil was lost in 1654, the family had to look for other investments. And because of their experience, they thought that sponsoring this voyage, Jan thought that sponsoring this voyage with Dirk Peterson would be a good idea. So therefore, what's interesting is that this first voyage that arrives in New Amsterdam with, we don't know the precise number of slaves, we think it was maybe at least 50, perhaps 60. This number of slaves was organized deliberately by these two individuals. They didn't know they were coming. Stuyvesant was unaware that it was on the way. He was traveling and then had returned back to New Amsterdam recently and found out that they were there. They had been put up for sale. And most of the enslaved Africans that were brought on the Wittepart were sold to a Virginia tobacco planter named Edward Scarborough. We know that because the reason why the Virginians were so interested was not just because of the labor that they could get from the enslaved Africans, but also because for every person, enslaved or free, that was brought into the colony, they would get a certain amount of land. And so we know that Edward Scarborough and his family and friends and relatives at that particular point in time received a significant number of property. And so we equate that property with the number of people that he purchased on the Wittepart. So it isn't until several years later that another experiment in the slave trade takes place. And this is something that I've just written about. It's in 1659, the West India Company deliberately writes to its vice director in Curacao, Matthias Beck, and says, we want you to organize and send a parcel, to experiment with a parcel of Negroes, that's the term that they used, to send to New Amsterdam, to sell to the inhabitants there at public auction, and to open the slave trade to all the inhabitants of New Netherland. Now, why would the West India Company now all of a sudden be interested in this slave trade, whereas before they had not? The answer is, again, because of changing conditions in the Atlantic world. As I mentioned before, Brazil was no longer a Dutch colony. It had been lost to the Portuguese in 1654. The Dutch, however, were still active in Africa, and they were looking to redirect their African trade, and they were going to do it through the island of Curacao. And you can see the island of Curacao that I've identified on this map from 1662. You notice where it's located in relation to the rest of the Caribbean. Curacao would soon become the slave trading entrepot in this particular part of the world. And so if Curacao was going to be the slave trade supply center for the Spanish colonies, and by the middle 1660s, they actually get the right to sell directly to it. They found ways of doing it before then. They could then experiment by sending some slaves directly to New Amsterdam and to see if they could be used by the people there. So this first experiment, there was the first ship that actually sent enslaved Africans to New Amsterdam from Curacao was a ship called the Spheramundi. Again, it was a private vessel. Matthias Beck enticed the owner with very liberal freight rates, promising him trade, and a small cargo, using the term that they used, a small parcel of 5 children who were below the age of 16 were sent directly to New Amsterdam. 4 arrived. One of them died on the month-long voyage. They traveled on the Spheramundi, which was a relatively small ship, along with a huge cargo of salt. And that's the first to arrive. Now, why would other people be interested in this slave trade? Manhattan merchants, the people that I've been studying for many years, the Manhattan merchants were very interested in this because they were beginning to see the possibility of integrating the Virginia tobacco trade in with the trade that they were sending back to Amsterdam. And it's in the early 1660s that there's actually a treaty negotiated between merchants who represented Peter Stuyvesant and the government of Virginia, where they would agree to exchange slaves. They would agree to exchange more tobacco at favorable rates if slaves could be included in that arrangement. So Manhattan merchants were interested and were willing to explore this possibility. Also interested, a little bit later on, were the people that are in charge of the New Amstel colony. If you remember, I showed you the New Amstel colony, which was on the Delaware River. The Dutch had taken it back from the Swedes by 1655. The city of Amsterdam actually set up the colony of New Amstel on the Delaware. And the man they had in charge of that, a man named Alexander de Hinojosa, was in direct contact with the Maryland governor, Philip Calvert, to talk about Maryland tobacco. And as a result of various plans that they had negotiated, they were going to send Dutch merchandise into the Delaware River, pick up Chesapeake tobacco, set up a special city on the Delaware River. And that was going to be a slave trading port as well as a tobacco exchange port. So a lot of people become interested in this particular opportunity, primarily for economic reasons. The Gideon, which was the last ship that was chartered by the Dutch West India Company before they lost the colony to the English invasion in 1664, was deliberately set up to send slaves from Curacao, a large number of slaves. They originally talked about over 300 slaves, 290 enslaved Africans arrived in August of 1664. 25% approximately were going to go to the colony at New Amstel, and the others were going to be put up for sale, in New Netherland. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, the experiment came to an end. And let me just show you a little bit about the experiment we're talking about. This is the extent of the experiment, the number of ships that were actually involved. If you notice that I picked the first 5 or so because there are relatively small numbers involved. The first, as I mentioned, is the Sferamundi. 5 or 4 arrived. The Eichenbaum, then the New Netherlands Indian in 1660. Then in 1661, another voyage of the New Netherlands Indian. 36 arrived out of 40 that were sent. And then in May of 1664, another 40. You can see how different the Gideon cargo was compared to the others. One thing to mention that I'd like to mention here is that we see the title of one of those ships, the New Netherlands Indian. We know that at one particular point, it was right around the spring of 1660, that Peter Stuyvesant had enslaved some of the Native Americans that had been captive in one of the wars and sent them to Curacao. They were ultimately, some of them were ultimately sent back. It didn't really work very well, but that was the name that was given to that. So this is the end of the experiment. What I think is important to realize is this commodification that I mentioned before. It's commodification on display in so many of these instances that I've just described to you. When they referred to, in the documents that we have, when they referred to the people that were forced captives, they referred to them as stux Negroes, meaning pieces of Negroes, or like head of cattle. That's the term that they used to refer to the people that they were transporting. They would label those people who were being transported. I've never found any incident of branding. Other historians think they have found something. I've never seen that. I've seen that a labeling on their clothing was something that was discussed. We know that to show a good example of commodification, Beck, when he sent slaves directly to New Amsterdam, he didn't take the healthiest slaves initially. He sent those slaves that were going to be rejected by his Spanish buyers who were paying more of a price for them. And when the slaves arrived in poor condition, and some of them were old and infirm, Peter Stuyvesant tried to encourage the sale to the local inhabitants by selling them quickly, putting them up for sale before they perished, lowering the price, providing various kinds of flexible financing and incentives for people to buy it. You didn't have to pay cash. You could pay 25% down. At times, you could also you could also pay in foodstuffs and commodities, whatever was available, so that he tried to make it easier for those people to purchase the slaves. One of the most frightening and I think most revealing aspects of the commodification was the one that I put on the advertisement for this talk, and that's the list of the purchasers from a slave auction that took place in May of 1664. There were 15 individuals that were on this list. If you can, I just want to mention this. If you wonder about why these documents look this way, these were the original Dutch documents that were kept at the New York State Library throughout up until the early part of the 20th century. And then in 1911, there was a huge fire that destroyed many of the documents. And these documents were severely damaged, as you can see, by the fire. These documents have been translated and restored by Charlie Gehring and Yanni Venema. Their work has been ongoing for decades. And we always pay homage to their work when we talk about them. If it wasn't for them, there was so much that we wouldn't know. But I think it's interesting to look at this, and I'll give you a focus on one, because there's clear price differential. There are a lot of, like I said, 15 individuals were involved. The individuals that were involved, interestingly, were not people who were purchasing them necessarily for farm labor. If the West India Company thought they were going to be useful for farming, none of these people were small farmers. None of these people, they were all members of, the merchant elite. One of them was a man named Thomas Willett, who has always been seen as the first English mayor of New York City, but he was actually a pilgrim who had grown up in Leiden, who spoke Dutch and who was a longtime resident of Manhattan, back and forth. I mentioned this one. We also find on this, if I can point this out, David, I think knows about this. We see right here, a young Jacob Leisler purchases one, it says Neger, for 615 guilders, which was a huge price. We think this was probably a healthy person that he was going to use in his warehouse. If I can get a little closer to this, this is, again, a translation. You see that Nicholas Varlet on the colonist account, meaning on his particular account, he had one negress, but it's negrin, for 290 guilders. The F is the guilder. One the neger or one negro for 399 guilders. One negress and her kind and her child for 360. And then also one negress. So what's interesting about this, obviously, is that Nicholas Varlet is not only purchasing 5 people, but he's purchasing a mother and her child. Now, I wonder, where are these prices coming from? These are prices, they're relatively consistent in the 290 to 360 guilder range, except for the one that Leisler purchased. It's possible that there was some equation that was made in terms of labor, that labor for an unskilled laborer, farmer, and for a soldier and a sailor in the Dutch West India Company was between 85 and 114 guilders per year. So we don't know this for sure. This is my speculation. But for these enslaved Africans, perhaps the equation was you were thinking of them in terms of a 3-year or a 4-year service. And for that, you could pay approximately what you would pay for an unskilled labor. But again, this is questionable. I wish I could get your questions now, but I'm sorry, we can't do that. Another example of commodification, and we have to look closely at this, and I'll try to explain this to you. This is not a ship that actually went to New Amsterdam, but it was a ship that brought slaves from West Africa to Curacao right around the time of the beginning of that experiment with a parcel of Negroes that I talked about. And this, again, it's from the Curacao papers, again, that Charlie has been translated, and you can't really see it here, but what it's basically saying is that here's a list of the slaves that died on the ship St. Jan, and a statement about the shipwreck. But what is listed here is really an accounting of the number of men, mans, Frauen, women, and youngen who died per day on the voyage. And you see the subtotals here. It's set up like a spreadsheet. This, I'm sorry you can't see it, but this one here, on this particular day, this one man overboard gesprungen, which means this one man jumped overboard. And this is the one way that we can begin to understand what that voyage was like. The problem with this, and the problem with the documents that we use, is that we very rarely get to know how this commodification, how the slave trade was experienced by the actual people that were forced to take this journey. We have 2 examples, however, from the Witte part, and it's not directly from the enslaved themselves, it's from others. We know, for example, when the Witte part that I mentioned before in 1655, and the Witte part arrived in New Amsterdam, the slaves that arrived were put up for auction by the skipper of the ship. Stuyvesant wasn't present at the moment. The skipper was the one that organized it. The skipper's last name was Zwart, which was an interesting name because Zwart in Dutch means black. We know of 2 people that were on the Witte part. We know what their experience was like. The first one was a woman who was unnamed, who was forcibly intoxicated by the ship captain, Zwart, to mask her serious illness. We know that she was taken screaming through the street to the home of the person that purchased her at the auction, Nicholas Bout, She obviously realized her condition. She knew that she was dying. When she arrived at the house of Nicholas Bout, she died within 3 hours after she was purchased. The only reason why we know about her is because Nicholas Bout sued the captain for fraud, that he deliberately sold something sold a person that was ill. The other person that we know something about is a person on the Witte part named Antonio. And Antonio was most likely sold by Edward Scarborough, who I mentioned was the major purchaser, sold by Edward Scarborough to that person, Simon Overzee, that I mentioned, who Dirk Peterson Witte part had known. Simon Overzee, by this time, had moved to Maryland, was setting up his own plantation. And we know that Antonio had run away several times, refused to accept his situation as being enslaved. He refused to work. And because of his refusal and because of his obstinacy, at least in the minds of his resistance, essentially, but obstinacy in the minds of Overzee, Overzee had him corrected, and that was the term that was used. The correction was whipping, and then Overzee had hot lard poured into his wounds and had him hanged, stretched out, almost crucified on a ladder where he died. And the only reason why we know about this is because Overzee's political enemies had him charged with manslaughter in Maryland. Overzee was acquitted. So now on to the experience for the enslaved in New Amsterdam. Before I begin, I'd just like you to know that there were no, because of the way that slavery was brought into New Amsterdam, initially by privateers and then relatively late in the colony's history, there were no slave codes, there were no laws, there were no specific aspects of society that spelled out how the slaves would be treated, how the slaves would be considered legally. We know obviously that the enslaved were put to work. Initially, they were purchased by the company. They were company slaves. They cut wood, they built fortifications, they built roads, they burned lime, they worked on company farms, later worked on Stuyvesant's Bowery. They were involved in the military, given weapons to help fight in some of the Indian wars. Some may have become skilled craftsmen, although we don't know that for sure. Their labor was not easy. We have some evidence that maybe a few of them were actually used on a chain gang because they resisted their enslavement. We know that some whites, as punishment, were forced to work with enslaved Africans, so the labor was not easy. But some of these enslaved Africans had some control over their free time. Some of them were able to work for themselves to earn extra money. And we know that some of them actually accumulated some funds over time. We also know that, again, with the fact that there were no slave codes, no specific laws and regulations, that in these early days, at least up until 1644, there was some effort to integrate and to accommodate and to adjust as being members of the local community. So we know, for example, that members of the first enslaved Africans to arrive, this is before the experiment that I mentioned, before the Witte part, certainly before the Gideon, they were baptized and married in the Dutch Reformed Church. They were probably Christian themselves. Many of them may have come from Angola. We know that some of their last names that they were given were Angola, and that signified, because they were Angola, that they may have been Christian in Angola, because Angola was a Portuguese colony and Portugal had brought Christianity to the Africans that were living in Angola. We also know that they had access to the company court, that they would be involved in lawsuits. And we also know of the fact that they actually had some sense of their own personal agency, that they were conscious of their condition. Again, we don't have slave narratives, we don't have firsthand accounts. This is just what we can surmise from the available evidence that we can gather. We know, for example, that 9 of these company slaves were accused of murdering another slave, Jan Primero, in 1641. And all 9 of them, when they were confronted, they said that they all did it together, to somehow join together so that not one of them would be punished. Maybe they all did it together. We don't really know, but the company decided that one would draw lots, and whoever got the shortest straw, so to speak, would be the one that was executed. The person that got the shortest straw was a man named Manuel de Garrett de Reyes, who's probably enslaved by someone named Garrett de Reyes from what is now Albany, but in Rensselaerswyck. And when he was put on the scaffold for execution with 2 ropes around his neck, when he was pushed off, both ropes broke. The crowd thought that was a sign from God, and he was let go. So what's interesting about this story, I think, is not just, there are many interesting aspects of the story, but to me, those people, those 9 that were accused, were very conscious of joining together in their resistance to what they were being accused of. I thought that's very significant. Things begin to change, though, in 1644. We have some formal example of that, and that's what I'd like to move on to here. Show you an example of this. Okay, in 1644, many of those who had been accused of the murder of John Primero actually petitioned the West India Company for their freedom. Now, that's interesting to note first, because their names are below. You can see the names. I've tried to highlight that in white. So, for example, you can see up here, Paulo Angola, Grote, Big Manuel, Klein Manuel. They were the ones that petitioned the West India Company for their freedom. They said that we have been, this is a copy of their petition. We don't have the actual petition they presented. They may have done it in person. They may have done it in writing. We don't really know, but this is the record from the West India Company court in February of 1644. They said that we have been working long enough. We've been working for 18 or 19 years, which puts them right at the beginning of the arrival of the Brownvis that I mentioned before. And that we think you promised us essentially our freedom, and we think now is time for our freedom. Their freedom was granted by the West India Company, by Willem Kieft, the director, saying that they would be free and at liberty, the same as other people, but they had to pay a tribute to the company, which would be 1 hog or 23 bushels of corn. They agreed to work for the company when the company needed them. And it also said that their children would remain slaves. I'll come back to this in a minute. Now, from the enslaved perspective, why did they choose this particular moment in time to make this petition to the West India Company? Notice that they are using their right to petition, and this is being granted and accepted by the West India Company. We think that it has to do with the Indian wars that were taking place at the time. Kieft's War was going on, beginning in the early 1640s, had gone on through 1644. He thought that this might be a good time. They thought that this might be a good time to use their influence in fighting for the director to pressure that. They also used an example of we need to take care of our families, and we can't do this anymore. And from Kieft's perspective, it was expensive and difficult for the company to continue to support slaves. So he was interested, perhaps, in relieving himself of the burden, but quickly gave them land north of the city. And I'll talk about that in just a second. So what's interesting is that in 1644, this does not set a rigid standard for what will follow. This is not what every other person that was enslaved, not the conditions under which they would achieve their freedom. Other people were freed on different terms. For example, Jan Francisco Jr., and we think this was the son of Jan Francisco, you see him down here, who was probably an adult child, but he was granted his freedom without any stipulation, not any stipulation about children, because obviously maybe he didn't have any. We know that someone named Manuel the Spaniard was freed by a colonist named Philip Jansen Ringo in February of 1648. And again, there was a payment of money involved. Stuyvesant also freed 3 women later on in the 1660s on the condition that one of them would clean his house every week. The others were freed with fewer requirements, but there was no statement about children. Now, the question about children is interesting because there's no evidence that children were ever forcibly enslaved after that. The West India Company was actually challenged by other members of the colony of New Amsterdam, saying that this violated, basic rights of human beings, and that they shouldn't be allowed to do this. The West India Company person on the ground said, we're only going to keep about 3 of the older people, and most of the young children would not be enslaved. We don't really know specifically what happened. But it remained on the books, supposedly based on this petition, and it came up again in the later 1660s. But what this says, I think, at this particular point in time, and going forward with this petition about land, and I'll talk about land in a second, is that slavery as an institution in New Netherland is kind of amorphous. It's uncertain. There's a lack of clarity that accompanies it. There could have been, as Andrea Mosterman says, and she will tell you a bit more about this, a hierarchy of slavery, that there was some that actually could achieve freedom. There was some that achieved what they called half freedom, but only by the 1660s were they using that term. And there were many that were never freed at all, and we don't know much about them. Many of these petitioners that I just mentioned, I'm sorry, I couldn't get a better slide, but I wanted to recognize Christopher Moore's work, who passed away recently, who actually put this together. Some of these people that signed the petition actually were given land in what is now Washington Square Park in New York City. And those are some of the same names that you can see, on that petition that I just showed you. So after the 1640s, for those that remained in the city, many of them continued to have those same legal rights, petitioning the court that I mentioned before. They remained part of the Dutch Reformed Church. And there was also a remarkable degree of interaction between the white population and the enslaved population and the free Black population, especially in the island of Manhattan. And again, this is, I want to show you an example of this. This is a map from 1639 that showed that at this particular point in time, this area here was the area that was said to be the quarter of the Blacks of the company, Black slaves of the company. But this is in 1639. It wasn't necessarily a slave quarters. It was just an area where the West India Company slaves were kept. We know that by the 1640s, many of them had moved away and were living within the city. And this is, again, Andrea Mosterman will talk to you about this, and she gave me permission to use this today. We know that many of them actually lived right here, where number 1 is. It was called the Slijksteeg, the residence of people enslaved by the company. But they had complete freedom of movement around the city. And we know that they were active in the Madeleine, I can't read her name, Madeleine Vincent's Tavern over here, that they were actually in Rutgerson's Tavern, and they actually frequented here, Jacobson's Tavern, in addition to free Africans and white laborers. They also know that they were able to get into the church, which was in the Reformed, the Reformed Church was inside the fort. And there was also an extension of the church, a smaller church built here on Peril Street, all within easy walking distance. This is the Costello plan. And what Andrea has done is identified these different places here. So this shows an incredible integration and areas of interaction between the different people that were enslaved and free and were not, and were white. But it doesn't mean, I think, that that slavery was a benign institution. It doesn't mean that that these were happy slaves, that this was a very different kind of slavery. It just means that there was something different about these conditions. We know, for example, examples of slave resistance that reminds us of their awareness of their condition. We know of one particular instance where a woman named Palesa van Angola was accused of stealing. She was a company slave, and she was sold as a result of her theft. We also know that an unnamed enslaved African was also sold by the company because of laziness and unwillingness. Clearly these were examples of resistance. We also know that in 1664, an enslaved African named Lisbeth Antonison was sentenced to death for deliberately burning down the house of her master, Martin Quigere. The sentence, however, was immediately suspended with the provision that Lisbeth be put through the preparations of an actual execution. So she was chained to a stake. She was subjected to the rest of the preliminary procedure for strangulation and burning, but it was never completed. Afterwards, she was sold at an auction. I should mention that there was no evidence of enslaved Africans ever being executed. There was only one person that was executed. We believe he was an enslaved person, but he was executed in 1646 for raping a 10-year-old boy. And his penalty was being strangled and his body was being burned. So there are lots of unanswered questions we have about what we call Black agency, what the enslaved Africans were really doing and thinking and feeling. Susanna Romney has recently made an effort to understand the life of one enslaved woman, Rachel Angola, and I would refer you to her article. We also don't know how the resident enslaved and free reacted to the newly arrived captives who were coming from Curacao. To me, that must have been striking, to have been living in New Amsterdam for years, and then to see the arrival of enslaved people coming from Curacao and being sold at auction. We don't really know exactly what they were thinking, but there's some circumstantial evidence to suggest that they were aware of that they were concerned about their condition. We have a complaint that was made by one of the conservative ministers that was living in New Amsterdam in 1660, right around the time where that experiment was just beginning with the slaves from Curacao. And he remarked that although he saw some hope for the Black children that were enrolled in his catechism classes, he was afraid that the parents only wanted their children to be baptized to protect their freedom. Is this something that the people that were enslaved were concerned about and saw the way of protecting themselves and their children was by having them baptized because Christians could not be enslaved? We also know in terms of agency, we also know that when the ships arrive in the harbor, when the English invasion ships arrive in the harbor 2 weeks after the arrival of the Gideon, we know that several enslaved Africans who had been given their half freedom the previous December now requested their full freedom from Peter Stuyvesant when they saw the English ships arrive. Clearly, they were afraid that their status would not be respected by the English, and it was something that Stuyvesant was willing to grant them. So to kind of put some of this in perspective, some tentative statistics. These statistics are always questionable. We always revise them and try to understand which would work best. We know that in 1644, the time that I'm talking about, approximately 120 slaves, enslaved Africans, adults and children were living in, were living in Manhattan. And we're not sure how many had been living in other parts of New Netherland. We know that by 1656, only about 150 Africans were living, 50% of them free. Many of them may have come from, that one privateer that I mentioned, the St. Anthony, that arrived in 1652. We know that in 1658, the West India Company was actually reducing the number of enslaved Africans that they owned. We found a complaint from one of the West India Company officials that said, we just can't afford to keep that many people enslaved. So only 12 to 16 enslaved Africans. And then statistics that we're getting from, most recently from Patricia Bonamy that I think are accurate, maybe 170 Blacks were living in the colony in 1660, 70 to 75 were free, not counting the ones that arrived on the Gideon, which were 290. So, and just for comparison, in 1664, the New Amsterdam free white population was approximately 1,500. Now, to serve as kind of an epilogue to this, the New Netherland era of control of what becomes New York was from basically 1609 to 1664, restored for 2 years, from 1673 to 1674. And this is the period that I've been describing for you now. But what happens in subsequent centuries is that the laws hardening the institution of slavery begin in 1702 and especially in 1712. And from then on, in the early 18th century, throughout the 18th century, slavery is a rigid institution with specific laws that prohibit interaction, prohibit many things about enslaved Africans that we would normally associate with slavery. It isn't until after the American Revolution, 1799, that there's a gradual emancipation law passed, and final emancipation in New York doesn't really take place until 1827, but probably lingers even further. What Andrea Masterman will probably tell you is that many of those who remain slaveholders were members of the original Dutch community, so or Dutch ethnic. And so this might have something to do with what I've just been describing to you. But to show you again, get this to work. Getting back to some other statistics, I just kept in white what I showed you before. But notice that from 1665 to 1775, we find a much larger number of enslaved Africans that are arriving into New York. When Andrea Masterman estimates that and from the slave trade database, that 7,000 enslaved Africans disembarked in New York. In 1703, there were about 800 enslaved in New York in the entire colony. That number is increased of a total population of 18,000. Notice that the numbers continue to increase throughout the 18th century. So the period that I've been describing to you is actually the early period before there is what becomes, a more rigid institution and a larger number of enslaved Africans living in New York City. So I'd like then just to try to put together some tentative conclusions or some ideas just to wrap up what I've just been talking about. First of all, I think it's important to know that the institution and the experiences of the enslaved evolve over time. Slavery that begins in New Amsterdam, if it begins with the arrival of the Brownvis in 1627, or if it begins with the institution of slavery in the early 18th century, it's an evolutionary process. It's not something that begins and is maintained. It's something that evolves over time. Its flexibility and uncertainty, I think, in the initial New Netherland period is probably due to the fact that it wasn't a well-planned strategy. The West India Company had designs to bring slavery to New Netherland, but they were never able to do that until they gave permission to the Wittepart and until they experimented with a parcel of Negroes, beginning in 1659. I think the lack of clarity initially allowed for some slave agency and some accommodation as the West India Company and the whites that were living there tried to extend their own cultural features to those new arrivals through their church, through their court. I think the small numbers that we were talking about that I've tried to identify with the statistics certainly had an impact on this experience. I think the changes that we see happening later are in some degree a direct reflection of the increase in the numbers. And the fact that it applied primarily to Black Africans and those few Indians that I mentioned reveals perhaps that this was racial slavery in its infancy. But most importantly, I think for what I'm coming away from this with is that this was a product of the Atlantic world. It's not something that the Dutch or the English brought to America. Commodification was the critical element dating back to the 16th century in the Atlantic world. Perhaps in New Netherland, the initial pricing related to a comparison with white labor, but we don't know that. They were comparing perhaps to labor, but later on they're putting a price on individuals. So what I'd be curious about, to get your questions or reactions in the chat, would be to understand a little bit more about what ways do you see an understanding of New Netherland slavery contributing to our current discussions, and in what way do you think it's valuable? I've been speculating about this myself for a long time. I think the one thing that strikes me is that the lack of institutional clarity allowed for some flexibility that I think would have prevented economic forces from changing things in the direction that they ultimately went in. But I'd be more interested in hearing your thoughts And so that's all I have to say. Thank you very much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, wonderful. Dennis, thank you so much. This was a lot of information, and for me, a lot of new information about the colony and about the institution of slavery. And I think it's very useful to see it in all of its forms and how it was different in different geographic locations because of economics and various things. So please, any participants who would like to comment, and I know Dennis really wants to hear your questions and comments on this information, you can put your questions in the chat. So the one question is from William. Do you have any information, this is very particular, as to whether any of the original 11 slaves in New Amsterdam who gained partial freedom participated in attacks on Native Americans during Willem Kief's?
Willem Kief's, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Not any specific references, but we do know that that Kieft armed some of the company slaves with pikes to use against the natives. Specifically in what campaign and specifically how they were used, I don't know.
All
but
right.
we know that he definitely intended to use them for military purposes.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks for your question, Willem.
So if anyone, oh yes, I have another from Catherine. You referenced at one point to a number of free whites. Does that suggest that whites too were enslaved or indentured?
No, I must have misspoke. I'm sorry. No, I think there were of course whites that were indentured servants who were not considered to be free because they were bound by contract. You know, the same way that members of the West India Company, soldiers in the West India Company, were bound by contract to the West India Company. But I wasn't trying to suggest anything with that. No.
Okay. And this is from Josephine. Hi, Dennis. Thanks so much for your talk. I'm curious if in your research, have you come across other auctions or other slave dealings in Esopus, Kingston, Ulster County? Wait, it just moved. I know of an auction in 1674 in Esopus, but I'm wondering if you've come across anything earlier. Thank you.
No, but I'd love to know about that Esopus auction.
Hi, Dennis. Yeah, it's actually, I don't
know.
Oh,
Josephine. Okay, hi.
Hi. I don't know much about it. I can find the information, but it was an auction in Esopus where there was a court case later because Louis Dubois had purchased two enslaved people, Anthony and Susanna, at that auction, and then he was challenged as that they had escaped from the Caribbean, I believe. So I don't know the details. I just know that it's referenced, and I can send you the citation if you'd like. But yeah, I'm curious. I'm looking for information relating to slavery being practiced in Ulster County before we know that it was practiced by some of the New Paltz patentees.
I would say that I think I don't know about any particular case, but Josephine, you could give me some more information. I'd be interested to know who held the auction and why was the auction held? I mean, that's, you know, to me, is it because of a death and the slaves were put up for auction, which could very often happen, it's possible. Was there a suit for fraud? I'm who's sponsoring the auction and for what purpose? And do you have a final determination of what happened with that? And you know, it's interesting to see how the procedures for auction would take place in the 1670s, which is not that far removed from the time period that we're talking about. So certainly the precedent for auctions was there. But we found evidence of auctions. The work that I've done on the Phillips family later on, and like when the Phillips family members passed away in the 18th century, some of their slaves would be sold at auction. So that was just a way of resolving an estate. So that's why I was asking about that.
Right. Well, great. I'll message you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.
To chat more about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Josephine.
Thanks for listening.
And
Oh.
Ed, did you have something, Dennis? I'm sorry.
No, I'm just looking at the next question.
Edwin Blue asked if there's an evidence of uprising of groups of slaves in New Netherlands.
No, in New York, yes. I mean, there were two slave rebellions, one in 1712, one in 1741. But there was no evidence of a slave rebellion as such. You know, there were small, what I was trying to look for were evidence of slave resistance, and resistance can take many, many different forms. You know, resistance can be like Antonio refusing to work. That's a form of resistance. It could be theft. It could be running away. And there's not that much evidence of runaway slaves. Actually, more indentured servants ran away from New England. There were constant pleas between the governors of New England trying to get their runaway servants back. You find more enslaved Africans running away later on in the non-New Netherland period, in the later half of the 17th century. I found one that ran away from the Phillips estate in the 1680s, I believe. But those are examples of slave resistance, but no examples of large-scale slave rebellions in New Netherland. No.
Okay. And Jim asks, can you talk about slavery in our area, which is Columbia County?
I wish I could. No, I don't. I don't know. God, who's doing? I'm just blacking her name. God, maybe if I can take a look at. There's somebody that's doing work on Hudson Valley slaves because her family were slave owners.
Yes. And I can't think of her name right now either, but
she's writing a book. She wrote it.
Yeah, it's African American Archives of
Debbie Bruno. Yeah, Debbie Bruno.
Oh no,
yeah.
That's not the person I'm thinking
Deborah
of.
Bruno is the person I was thinking of, and she has a piece in there was a Wall Street Journal piece that she did several years ago, and I know that she's writing a book about those experiences, and she would know more about Columbia County. Sadly I don't know.
Okay. There is an organization also because their family were enslaved persons and they stayed continuously in Columbia County until now. It's called the African American Archives of Columbia County. And they're just getting started, but they've already found some wonderful things. So I'm going to try to get that in the chat when you're answering a question.
Oh yeah, I'd love to know more about that. I think one of the most exciting things for me is hearing stories about new discoveries that you're coming up with, that you've seen. And to stimulate that kind of work, I think is probably one of the greatest results of me giving a talk like this, to know that other people are interested and other people are finding more and more things. And that's the way we're really going to discover that.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. I'd love to know more about that. That's exciting.
Sure. And then Jim also asked, how much was it a factor in the economy of this area during the Dutch era? I think.
How much? I don't understand the question.
I think how much was slavery a factor in the economy? Jim, if you want to unmute yourself and clarify the question in the economy of this area.
I would say that later on, if we can go back to this slide, if you take a look at this, the total population in New York City was significantly increased. But notice that at the bottom here that there were 21,000 enslaved in New York by the time of the American Revolution. So I would say that by the time of the American Revolution throughout the 18th century, a sizable portion of the rural areas, as well as in New York City, employed slave labor. And so in terms of, we can't put a price tag on it, but we know that there were many farmers, especially of Dutch ancestry, that held one or two enslaved Africans. And some of them were among the most resistant to giving up slavery because of the labor that they got from them. So I would say that by the 18th century, enslaved labor was significant throughout the New York region.
Yeah, and we had a talk by Travis Bowman
Sure.
Yeah, I figured you would know. It was from the Leisler Institute collaboration also. So we had this talk by Travis Bowman, who's from the historical preservation part of the New York State Parks Department. And he has really, gone into, and especially in our area, in the Hudson Valley, all of what a slave would cost and how even a middle-class farmer could afford, a slave or two, and they would have, enslaved persons in their home. And, I love that he made the point also that even though it was a more intimate situation with a slave, enslaved person in your house, it was not any less brutal, which you also made in your talk. But
right, Travis and his organization, the Department of Parks and Historical Preservation, and I always get all the words wrong, but they're doing remarkable work. Travis is an excellent resource, and he's putting together some really fascinating things. There are also some interesting things going on the eastern end of Long Island as well, and so more and more people are uncovering new things about enslaved Africans. But this is mostly, I think, from the later period that I really didn't discuss at this particular time. I was just talking about that early period, but as I was trying to emphasize that slavery as an institution and the number of people enslaved really increases significantly, in the 18th century, and it's not as significant, for the economic development of the colony in the New Netherland period. It's important, but it's not as significant for the overall economy.
Okay, thank you. And Russell Shorto said, Dennis, great talk. After having done this deep dive into all the recent scholarship, including your own, what are your thoughts on models for the evolution of slavery in New Netherland?
Yeah. I mean, Dennis and I have talked about this. I just wondered if he had any further thoughts since putting this together. And I think it's a fascinating topic because people, what you try to find here is what was in people's minds in the 1630s or 1640s. If you were a white New Amsterdamer and you were engaged in somehow in whether purchasing an African, or it was just the company was doing it, but it was right in front of you, what were you thinking? And I think there's also the question of when does race and skin color become part of it? Because in earlier eras of slavery, like ancient Rome, race had nothing to do with it. If Rome conquered you, then those people were enslaved, and they may have looked just like the Romans did,
Yeah, no, I think that's a great question, and I don't think we can find a real answer to that, because I've asked myself that question many times. Like, what are people really thinking? Like, why? How can you buy and sell a human being? I don't get it. I think as a merchant, you're buying and selling everything else, and they're using different terms. It's the one thing that I was speculated with is that they're using different terms when they're trading Africans, and they're using different terms when they're meeting them on the street, when they're coming into direct contact with them. And I always thought that was significant. A face-to-face communication with an individual is different from a removed statistical accounting feature. When, for example, there was a case, I think her name was Christina. She was let's see if I can get this right. She was the daughter of two of the people that were probably included on that 1644 list who died soon after that they were granted their conditional freedom and their land. She was orphaned, but she was adopted by Domingo Angola. She eventually tried to, because of the case that was going on in the 1660s, there was an effort to try to make her free because of what was included under that 1644 provision. And Stuyvesant, who at the time was in charge, and his council basically said, no, under that condition, you could not be free. But then she was immediately, but they said, but we will let you go if you come up with 300 guilders or you find a replacement. And immediately, Howard Lookermans came up with the 300 guilders and freed her so she can marry the person that she wanted to marry. And so what's on the mind of Howard Lookermans when he's making that purchase? Is it a loan? Does he expect the money back? Or is he just realizing that this whole regulation from 1644 is stupid as it relates to this particular individual? I'm going to make things right because I've got the money and let me just do it. So there's an example of a face-to-face interaction that, to me, I don't necessarily think it shows kindness, but it shows an understanding of humanity that I think is lacking from the accounting practices of, the slave traders. So it's that face-to-face communication. When you're sitting in a tavern, with other people, and whether you're enslaved or not, and everybody's in their cups, so to speak, what's the conversation like? I can't imagine. I can't imagine. So you know what, Russell, we keep looking for evidence. We don't always find the evidence that we wish we had. So we speculate, and we speculate based on as good evidence as we can find. What do you think? I mean, what are your thoughts? I mean,
This is your talk, man. Well, I think Charlie Gehring points to the Netherlands Roman Dutch law. That was the law, yeah. And they going back to ancient Rome and what the practice of slavery was and was not there. I think he sees some connections that they may have had that in their mind as one of the things to kind of fall back on as you're trying to invent something.
But the one thing that's different, I know I've talked about this with Charlie too, but the one thing that's different is that the slaves that are making that petition in 1644 are talking about Dienstbarheit. They're talking about their service, their servitude, and they're referring specifically to servitude. And it's not indentured servitude, but it's servitude. So they're not referring to what could be, unless that's in Roman Dutch law, and that I don't know. But clearly they have something in their minds. And that relates to, we've done what we think you expected us to do, which is not Roman Dutch law. So again, we don't know. If they applied Roman Dutch law, then we would have a codex to refer to, that they immediately would impose that, but we don't have that. They didn't use that. So, okay.
All right, thank you, Russell. So Tom asks, I heard that some enslaved people worked on the famous wall that Stuyvesant built. Do you know if that was the case?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question. I think it's true that enslaved Africans for the West India Company worked on the wall, but they worked in conjunction with other free whites who are also employed by the city, required by the city to put in the labor to build the wall. So it's not just that enslaved Africans built the wall, they built it in combination with other people that were called on, whose labor was called on by the company and by the city. And that wall was built not to protect from the Indians, but to protect from the English. And so they built it together. There's a really interesting piece. I'm sorry, who asked that question? Is it, I can't remember.
Tom.
If you can find this, if I can look for it in a minute while we're talking, on the website for the New York City Municipal Archives, there's a whole series of Amsterdam stories that one of them relates to the building of the wall. And you could find it, there's a very interesting discussion there by one of the people that work for the archives. And while you're talking, I can see if I can find it for you and put it in the chat, but that might help answer the question. So I'm glad you asked that question. I had to cut something, so I cut that. So thanks for asking.
Found it, but I'm not sure it's the right wall, so you look. Marjorie asks, do you see cultural or religious differences between the English and Dutch that might have contributed to the different ways slavery existed under them? It's a pretty big question while you're looking something up.
Yeah, and I have to stop looking now.
Let me see if I can find what you're looking for. Okay.
I think the original, just looking at that, the 1664 turnover where the English arrive, they don't immediately impose their understanding of slavery, whatever that is. They're not directly involved. They're just getting involved in the slave trade themselves. The Royal African Company just begins to organize in the 1660s, and the Royal African Company is looking for ways of organizing a slave trade, primarily through the Caribbean and then into the North American colonies. But that's in the later half of the 17th century, where they're struggling with their own institutional development as well. Nichols, who's the English governor that arrives, actually is more interested in protecting the sale of slaves from the Gideon, because there were credit arrangements that were made, and he allows the credit arrangements to be completed. He doesn't confiscate the cargo. He's interested in confiscating the slaves that were the property of the West India Company, because the West India Company had to surrender. He wasn't interested in taking things away from the people that were already there. And actually, people that were already there were allowed to keep the slaves. And there were no real restrictions initially. Things begin to change by the 1680s as more and more slaves are brought into the colony, but there aren't any real strict regulations until later. So in a long way to answer your question, it isn't until I think back to the early 18th century that when New York is clearly integrated into the English Empire, that the English imperial structure begins to change as well. They begin to define their slave codes, although the English in Virginia, had their slave codes earlier than in New Netherland. In the 1660s, I think, they had their first restrictive slave codes. I'm not sure if that was deliberate or something that was, I don't think it was imposed by the English government. It was something that the Virginians decided to do because of the way they were depending more on labor. So it would almost go initially, by a colony basis.
The next question is somewhat similar. Did the Swedish colonists engage in the slave trade? Do you have information on that?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I would wonder. I mean, I don't know that much about the Swedish colony, the labor force in the Swedish colony. I don't believe so, but I couldn't swear to it. I don't know if Mark Thompson is on here. Mark Thompson is the expert on that, and he could answer that question, but I don't know. I would say I don't believe so.
Okay. All right. And if you get a chance, I messaged you with the link, I think, that you want, and I can send it to everyone if you want.
Yeah, it's Maika Lorenzini. That's it.
That's it. All right.
Yeah,
so
thank you.
Hit the return.
Yeah, Maika Lorenzini is the person that did it. And someplace in there, I'm not sure if it's part 1, part 2, part 3.
Okay.
But that's perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Just going back to where I was. David, did you want to unmute yourself and ask your question about the statistics or comment?
Well, I have two questions now, Dennis. One is, are there any statistics on the age of the enslaved when they were sold?
You mean on those auctions?
Right.
No.
Okay.
We would guess. The only information that we have on those auctions that I mentioned were general comments about their physical condition and that some were old, but we don't know what old means.
Right. It's interesting.
It could mean 35.
The other question is, have you done a comparison with Dutch Brazil? Where slavery?
No, I haven't done any comparison.
I mean, when one is trying to understand the Dutch attitude here in New Netherland, what would the attitude have been in the Dutch colonies elsewhere towards slavery, particularly where slavery is so important?
It's a really good question. The only thing that I've really looked at closely is the slave trade rather than the institution of slavery. And I know that with the slave trade in Brazil, that the West India Company opened up the slave trade to private investors. At the same time, they were doing it to the private investors in New Netherland. So they were making it available to individual entrepreneurs because they couldn't handle everything on their own. And again, things change after 1654 when Brazil is lost. So, but I don't know about the specific, the economy was very different in Brazil. I mean, you're dealing with what you can legitimately call, I think, plantations, sugar plantations in the Brazilian economy. There were no such similar plantations in New Netherlands. So they used the word plantation, but a plantation was generally an early planting of a farmstead that would ultimately become a more settled bowery. So you don't have the same kind of labor need. You don't have the same kind of organization of labor that you have in Brazil. And so I think the conditions for labor were very different, and therefore the conditions for interaction were very different. We do have examples of overseers in New Netherland, an example of an overseer or the supervisor of Negroes, one of which may have been enslaved African himself. And I'm sure there were overseers that were used in the Brazilian plantations, but I don't know specifically about them. So, but that's a really interesting question.
Yeah, I'm thinking more of the justification of racial slavery.
Well, there was a big argument, a big discussion over, the religious aspect of this. Can you legitimately enslave Christians? And if many of the people that were enslaved who were coming from Africa had been Christians in Africa, could they be legitimately enslaved? And the questions were raised about, could they be legitimately enslaved if they were taken in a just war? And so I think the philosophical questions about enslavement were taking place in Amsterdam at the same time. But I don't think it affected what was happening in Brazil or in New Netherland. That's a good question, though, David. I don't know. Let's talk.
All right.
Well, let's find out more. I don't know.
I mean, my research is showing a definite, it occurs later, much along the same lines that was happening down in the Chesapeake, where the justification for racial slavery is based on biblical precedents.
But this is later, right? This is like the 1680s?
1670s. It's after the
Okay.
period
Okay.
you're discussing. And my other thought is, as Benjamin Schmidt, was it, that wrote about,
Yeah.
and the concept of the Dutch talk very much about the concept of their being enslaved by the Spanish. So I think that they do have a pretty good concept of what slavery is. I've been looking a little bit at Justinian law, which of course is the basis of Dutch Roman law, and also at millennial pietist writings in the early 17th century. And slavery is talked about in those works.
But in New Netherlands, do you think it's similar to Roman Dutch law? I'm just bringing up Russell's question before.
Well, I mean, they're coming from that tradition. They're not, and then the New Netherlands didn't spring out of the ground without,
Right.
They're coming from the Netherlands, and their ideological concepts are coming from the Netherlands. Anyway, that's my thoughts on this.
But I wonder, I haven't seen the evidence of them putting into practice. I mean, the company doesn't seem willing to take that initiative. And I think, to come up with some kind of a rigid or a clear slave code. I mean, I think Stuyvesant and his council have opportunities to do that. Certainly the municipal government in New Amsterdam doesn't. And I just think it's easier for them to avoid the question.
Right. I think it's an interesting question. The whole thing is.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And worth a lot of discussion and research.
We should talk to Wim Klooster about slavery in Brazil. When we're done, I'm going to take a look at his book and see what he says about that.
Okay, great talk. Very interesting.
So we're past our time. We have a few more questions.
Sure.
Okay. Jean asks, who might know the most about the slave market from New Netherlands to Virginia? So I guess, Jean, do you want to unmute and are you looking for a book or a reference point or?
Well, I know that Edmund Scarborough came to New York and bought slaves, and I think David knows that as well. So I was just wondering who's doing some research about slave trading from other colonies to New York, to New Netherlands.
Well, I've been doing it, and that article that I did really talks about some of the same kinds of things you're talking about. The extent of that, I can't think of anybody. I mean, I can't think of anybody that's done anything more recent than I have, looking at those connections. So, I mean, maybe that article that I wrote might be useful to you. It's from the Journal of Early American History. I think it's mentioned someplace in the literature, but that might be valuable for you with the references.
And, Dennis, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just saying thank you. Wonderful talk.
Oh, sure. You're welcome. Thank you.
Dennis and David, I'm thinking we'd be happy because we have the email addresses of all the registrants to, send a resources list if you want to do that with the articles and things that you're mentioning, whatever we have in the chat.
That's the one article that I mentioned to that last question. I'm sorry, I forgot your name, but it's on the announcement.
Oh,
It's
okay.
called, To Experiment with a Parcel of Negroes. The reference is there, but Brenda, I could send you the specific reference, but
Okay.
it's available on JSTOR if she has access to JSTOR. Brenda, do you have access to JSTOR? Can you get that and make that available to your members?
Emily would know that, but I do not think we do. It's usually academic and we're a, public library, but so I don't think that we do. So Mary Ellen asks, is there validity to the old idea that Africans sold each other into slavery? And do we know the status of those being sold? Oh,
Well, we know generally that Africans sold Africans to the Europeans on the coast of Africa.
right.
We know that for sure.
Okay.
But in New Netherland and in New York and in North America, I haven't seen that.
Okay. And William asks, could you say something about the Pinkster holiday as it related to slaves in New Amsterdam?
I'm going to save that discussion of Pinkster for Andrea Mosterman, because in terms of Pinkster, we don't really have any evidence of Pinkster being celebrated in New Netherland and New Amsterdam, but we certainly know it's derivative from the Dutch culture. And I know that she mentions that in her book. She does quite a great job of it with her book, and I would just defer to her on that. So I recommend that you do that. But we don't find evidence of that in New Netherland. It comes up later for sure.
Okay. Tammy said, maybe this question is being answered now. In what ways did the institution change under the English? And I think you did speak about that in that question about the differences of slavery.
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of really good books that could help you get at that. I mean, Graham Hodges' Root and Branch is probably one of the better books that actually discuss what happens later. Jill Lepore has a great book on the slave uprising in 1741. There are some other books. I mean, Leslie Harris and Ira Berlin, I believe, have something that describes, I can't remember the exact title, that describes some of the institutional development that happens later. And then Andrea will allude to some of those things, definitely mentions those things in her book. But she's talked, as she will discuss with you, she's taking a different angle into that than just an institutional approach. Her thing is, her interpretation is just very unique and very thrilling, I think.
All right, great. Van Calhoun asks, I have an early Dutch heritage. I was raised with Black kids my own age here, named Van Duzen, Van Alstyne, Van Ness. Yep. Is there a huge divide between pre-1664, when the small slaving was introduced by individual Dutch entrepreneurs, and post-1664, when the English trend to institutionalizing the slave trade culturally accepted, endorsed, and encouraged? So that's similar to the other question with a lot more details.
I'm not sure what the question is. Not sure what you're trying to ask. I would say that I'm not surprised that the Van Duzens would be of African descent, that there could be Van Duzens. I don't know for sure, but it's not surprising.
Yeah,
I'm not sure where the question is in there.
I think he was asking about the divide between the pre-1664, when the enslaved persons were kind of small in number, and then after with the English, which I think we've kind of covered. Some of these questions have been in here for a while. So with that, I'm going to read what Catherine says. This has been a wonderful event with 3 exclamation points. And I agree. We really appreciate the scholarship. And I'm very glad for the participants and the discussions we were able to have with them. I'll ask David if he'd like to say any final words, and also Dennis. But I think this was really thrilling. It's a lot of new information. It was a lot for me to take in. So I wrote a lot of notes, and I'll be following up. But thank you so much. That was really great.
I just want to add my appreciation and what a rich topic this is. And you've given me a lot to think about, and I'm sure the rest of the participants. So I want to thank you for being willing to come forward.
Well, I want to thank you all for having me. And I wish, my only regret is that we couldn't do this in person so I could see you all and actually have a conversation. I'd really be interested in more of your reactions about this. It's not a topic that a discussion that will end here. It's something that I know we will all continue to look into. So thank you very much for your interest and for your time. I really appreciate it. I hope to meet you at some point, maybe when this pandemic is ever over. I'd love to come up to the library and say hi. So.
All right, well, you have an open invitation.
Yeah, great.
And we're
Thank
getting
you.
all kinds of thank you and excellent presentation. So thank you so much. And I see our library director, Emily, is there. And with that, we'll say goodnight. And really thank you, David and the Leisler Institute. And Dennis, this was wonderful.
All right. Thank you all. Take care. Have a good night. Stay
Good night.
safe.